All right. So taking a step back, and before we dive into the material here tonight, I want to take a step back and essentially consider where we're at, right? And so if you've attended any of our other webinars, or if you watch the previous recordings on our YouTube channel, you'll see this is one of my favorite slides to start with, right? And I believe it's extremely beneficial to consider where we're at. So over the course of the season, right, for a warm season grass down south, we're expecting in the wintertime grass is going to be dormant, right? Heading into the spring. So I'd say once we're getting, what do we say, about potentially up into this upper 60s or so, low 70s, we'll start to see that grass green up, potentially not quite be actively growing yet, but starting to green up a bit. And then as we start to head more so into the consistent 70 to 80 degree range, we'll see the grass really start to pick up, right? Now, what we're seeing in the majority of the country right now, right, we're past that 80 to 85 degree range, right? Now we're getting into the 90 degrees and above. We were just down in Texas last week, and so got my fair share of warmer weather, and glad to be back in Buffalo. But right now we are essentially at this yellow spot in the season, right, where the grass isn't necessarily dormant, right, we aren't necessarily at the same spot as we would be in the wintertime, but the grass may be slowing down, right? So it isn't at its maximum growth rate right now. So what do we need to consider in terms of our practices? Do we still want to water, mow, fertilize? That's what we'll be discussing here tonight. So we'll expect the grass to start to pick back up, so reach that maximum growth rate again here. I'd say, what would we say, about maybe end of August, beginning of September or so. The majority of areas, once the temps start to dip back down into that upper 80 range or so, before ultimately entering winter dormancy as the temps start to decline from there. So today, in terms of watering, if we were to view these actions on a spectrum, right, I would view watering as being one extreme. And so green means go, right? And this doesn't mean that we want to just water without any consideration, right? We still want to be mindful of how we're watering and how often we're watering. So still maintaining that deep and frequent schedule, but potentially tweaking it slightly. From a mowing perspective, I would view mowing on the other extreme. Right. And so we may not have to mow quite as much during the summertime just due to the grass not growing quite as much as during other parts of the season. So one of the questions we receive is, my grass looks healthy, but it doesn't seem to be growing, or I don't have to mow quite as much. Is this a bad thing? We'll chat about this. Thirdly, from a fertilization perspective, sort of in between. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be picking up in the number of applications, nor that we're going to eliminate them completely, but there are a few factors to consider when looking to apply a pouch during high heat conditions. And lastly, as I mentioned, we'll close the webinar here tonight, walking through some of the potential changes you may have already started to see in the lawn, and potential factors to keep an eye out for as we're getting ready to head back into the fall months, potentially cooler temps.
Yeah, and I just want to start us off with watering. This is oftentimes the most important practice that you're going to have during the summer months. This is something that can kind of make or break your green lawn in the summer, if the temperatures are right. So it's something you really want to be mindful of, especially in areas where you're going to have drought restrictions. You might have places where you can't water at all. So just focusing on keeping your grass alive, keeping it at least healthy enough to come back after this heat. So something to look at is you're going to be changing your frequency as you're watering. So, in the spring, a lot of hotter areas, since we're chatting about the South here today, are going to be twice a week. If it's 75 to 85, you're going to be watering, Monday, Wednesday, or something like that. You want to water about half an inch each time, just to give your grass enough water to sustain itself between these sessions. But once we start to get up to these higher temperatures, like Will mentioned, over 85, you are going to want to add a third watering there. And of course, there are caveats to this. If you have a very sandy soil, you might need to water a little bit more often. If you have a clay soil, I would stick to the 3 times a week, but implement what we call cycle soaking. So that is just watering in short durations during the period of time that you would water. So for example, watering 3 minutes, turning it off, letting it soak in, watering for 3 minutes again, and so on. Something like that will really help. I know someone mentioned cracking in their soil. So that is something that clay soils will do when they become hydrophobic. So that means they don't want to take up water anymore because they've been dried out so heavily. So cycle soaking is something that can remediate that. We'll get into some other options later, but that is something that you will see this time of year, especially, around the southern US. If you do have watering restrictions, you may need to limit yourself to twice a week. So currently where I'm at in Central Texas, we do have watering restrictions. I am only allowed to water twice a week. But since I am following that deep and infrequent watering schedule, my grass hasn't gone dormant yet. But I do supplement hand water things that do get a little bit hotter. So for example, in between the road and the sidewalk, I've got that little boulevard strip of grass right there that does tend to dry out more quickly. So I will hand water that one more time a week right now. Um, One way to kind of find out, if you're watering enough or if you're not watering enough, is just kind of, take stock of how your grass looks. If you're walking on it, you look behind you and you see your footprints are still there, you may need to add an additional watering. If you're not able to, you may just need to increase the duration of your waterings. If you see the leaves folding in half, you'll see this a lot more with St. Augustine, for example, than a Bermuda or a zoysia, since those leaves are much thinner. You'll start to see them fold, close, start to lay down. Going gold is when it starts to enter dormancy period, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Dormancy really does help protect these grasses. It's just like in winter, once it turns brown for the winter, it's, conserving its resources, making sure that's protecting itself from extreme conditions. So I know a lot of people want to avoid that. That's definitely understandable. Just know that, if it's 105 degrees, your lawn may just need to protect itself by going dormant for a little bit, and then you can resume, regular activity in a week or so once the temperatures have cooled off just a little bit. Um, Something else we want to touch on are morning versus evening waterings. So it does kind of depend on where you are in the US. So if you're somewhere more arid, for example, you can get away with evening waterings, and these are actually very helpful because that water will stay in the ground, and your grass will be able to take that up over a longer period of time rather than watering in the morning and it evaporates a lot more quickly. But somewhere more humid, for example, so Florida, Georgia, East Texas, that kind of thing, you're going to want to water in the mornings only, and that's really just to avoid any sort of fungal issues. For a lot of times, it's warm, it's wet, that's the best condition to get a fungus in your lawn. So we just want to avoid that, minimize any sort of risk, and just water in the mornings if you live in a humid area.
And Yvonne, just to really highlight this, right? Because this is, again, this might be for me being up in New York, but I was amazed right now with watering restriction. I mean, we for the majority of areas, we can maintain that green grass for the majority of the year, right? So do you have any tips for if we do decide to let the lawn go gold per se, right, and enter a summer dormancy, if it's a shorter period of time, how much water would you look to put down just to keep the crowns hydrated?
That's a great question. That's something that I don't think we talk about enough. If you are letting your lawn go gold, just watering half an inch a week will sustain it, and that will just make sure, that you're not losing your grass. So if you're in an area, I know there are some areas in Texas at least, where they're not allowing you to use your irrigation at all. I would just try to get half an inch of water down with your hand, with your, what are those called? Sprinkle, hose, sorry, with your hose. And that way, your grass will just be able to sustain itself until you're able to get back on a regular watering schedule. Mowing is something that is important, but nobody really thinks about. Usually you just go grab your mower, you mow, you throw it back in the shed, you call it a day. But this is something that can also really make or break your lawn, especially when conditions are so extreme. So you'll start to see a lot of lawns will brown more quickly than others from the tips. You'll see them kind of look a little more sickly compared to other ones. And this can a lot of times be attributed to a dull mower blade. So if you see this picture here for Purdue University, you start to see that tearing, the ripping, that will start to get the grass blade to go brown faster than just a clean cut. A clean cut is going to be healthier for your grass. It's going to mitigate stress, which is really what we want to do, especially in the summer. And it'll just keep it a little bit more healthy, a little bit more able to fight off any sort of disease or fungal issues. A lot of times, if we see, a grass dealing with a fungus or browning a lot more quickly than it has in the past, we'll start to see that very jagged look from a dull mower blade. Something else to keep in mind is that you do want to keep your lawn a little bit high in the summer just to allow it to conserve nutrients and kind of protect that crown right close to the soil from burning. So if you typically if you typically mow, 2.5 to 3 inches, I will bump that up to 3.5 to 4, something like that, just to keep it a little bit happier. Most warm season grasses, St. Augustine, zoysia, things like that, do like to be a little bit higher. So you can mow them at a 3 or a 4 and they'll be just fine. The only exception there would be Bermuda grass, who does really enjoy being mowed at a lower height. If you got hybrid, you can mow it as low as an inch. I've seen half an inch, but that might be a little too intense. And for common Bermuda, you would want to mow it at an inch and a half or so. Um, I will say with zoysia, it does dull your mower blades a little bit more quickly. So if you have a neighbor with St. Augustine and you have zoysia and you notice that your grass is tearing a lot more than your neighbors, it just means that you need to sharpen your mower blades a little bit more often, since zoysia is a little bit of a thicker grass, and it will dull those blades a little bit more quickly. Um, and one more thing to note is just, I know it's hot outside. I know you don't want to go out there and mow very often, but procrastinating on mowing will, keep the grass a little bit longer. Once you cut so much of that grass off, you will start to stress it out. So we do recommend just removing a third or less of the grass blade each time. I know it sucks to go out there, but it'll suck more when your grass is a foot tall and you have to mow it, speaking from experience. So I think it's better for everybody if we just go out there, at least once a week, give it a quick mow. It'll be faster, it'll be easier that way.
If I doubt this isn't really a question that we receive too frequently during the summer months here, but I have had it come up on occasion. So especially with Bermuda, for example, right, and mowing extremely low to try to encourage new growth, right? Just to highlight right now in the summer, if we're seeing the grass start to brown, would you recommend mowing it super short in an effort to try to encourage new growth? That's going to end up stressing it, correct?
I would say this is the worst time to try to scalp your Bermuda grass, which is usually what they call the practice of mowing a little bit shorter. I would say this is the time, if any, just to keep it a little bit longer. It might not look as good when you mow short again, but this is the best way to keep it healthy. Scalping Bermuda is really just the best time to do it is in spring. And you can do that with zoysia as well. But for now, we just want to mitigate stress, and that means, being a little bit nicer to your grass for now.
All right, so transitioning to fertilizing. So at this point in the year, you're most likely familiar with the application process, right? And familiar with the My Plan page. But just to highlight, the My Plan page is a great resource to have a general starting point, if you will, for when to apply the pouches. And so what I mean by this is, if you're looking to understand, okay, what is the general order of operations over the course of the season, this is a great resource. You can see I missed my final application last year, and I'm reminded of this whenever I look at my plan page, which is great. But also keep in mind that each season can bring its own conditions, right? So when looking to apply the pouches, the application dates on the My Plan page are a great starting point, but I wouldn't say that they're the end all be all, right? If we end up missing out on applying the pouch during the state range, that's okay, right? And we'll be able to incorporate the pouch later in the season. Ideally, we'd apply the pouch during the recommended application schedule, but my focus is ensuring that the grass is going to be best able to benefit from the application. So the first question I want you to ask is, what are we working with in terms of the grass? Is grass healthy? Is it going to benefit from the application? So if the temps are currently above 100 degrees for several weeks, or potentially even for much longer time period, that doesn't mean that you're unable to apply a pouch, right? We typically recommend applying a pouch below 85 degrees or so. So the workaround is we could look to apply it either in the early morning or late evening, right? Depending on where you're at in the country, arid area versus a humid area. But I also don't want to default to this, right? Just because it's going to be cooler in the morning or at night doesn't necessarily mean that a pouch is the best option. I want to consider essentially if the grass is starting to show any signs of stress. So as Ivana had highlighted earlier, if you decide that you want to allow the grass to essentially go gold for a period of time, right? Enter that summer dormancy. The temps are extreme and we just can't keep the grass green. I want to essentially allow the grass to conserve its resources for the time being. And if we apply some of these pouches, we're essentially encouraging the grass to grow, right? So if you have any questions, always feel free to follow up. That's what I try to keep in mind of, okay, is the grass going to be able to benefit from the application? If it's not, then it may be best to hold on to it until the temps start to drop a bit, or until the grass begins to, essentially the conditions are conducive to that grass growth, or prioritizing that grass growth. So ideally, we'd incorporate the pouches during the set time periods, but if we're able to reach that desired nitrogen load over the course of the season, I'm happy. Finally, one pouch to highlight. Lawn Aid is a pouch available on our website. We received quite a few questions about this pouch. It is a preventative summer heat stress treatment, right? So ideally, it's put down prior to the summer heat setting in. The pouches which you receive as part of your core plan, though, are the only required pouches per se, right? What you were paying for as part of your subscription is enough to essentially maintain that lawn. But if you're in an area, as Ivana had noted, with watering restrictions, or in areas where you feel that the grass just seems to struggle a little bit more due to the high heat conditions, Lawn Aid is certainly a pouch which may be beneficial to consider. And then closing out the webinar here tonight, this is really where I want to spend the majority of our time. Investigate. So despite best practices, especially at this point in the season, you most likely have a good understanding of the potential difficulties you're working with throughout the lawn at this point in the season, right? But I always want to consider the environmental conditions. So when we start to see a change throughout the lawn, consider what has been occurring. So for example, has there been a spike in temps, right? So if we went from 85 to 90 degrees up to 105 every day, might be the issue, right? So we could then consider, are we working with different grass types? Could we have a mixture? And if not, then we start to consider, well, has there been a change in the amount of natural precipitation, right? So with the spike in temps, have we seen an increase in the amount of rain, or has it been a bit drier than normal? Maybe this area is starting to experience drought stress, right? And also following up with an audit of the sprinkler system, just to make sure we don't have a broken sprinkler head, for example, or each area of the lawn is receiving proper coverage. Secondly, I strongly recommend keeping track of these changes. It's always helpful if you reach out to our team and you say, on this date, I noticed the lawn starting to yellow in this area and it spread quickly, or it didn't seem to spread, but it got worse than the impacted area, etc. Those are great notes to be able just to quickly and accurately identify what is occurring and how we can best improve the lawn. And then from there, we can identify the issues. So if we look at some of these photos in the upper right-hand corner here, we could be looking at a number of different factors at play depending on the point of the season, right? So if this were in the early spring, I would potentially consider if it could be cold damage from the winter or cold temps, right? I'd be considering if it could be a compacted area where the water isn't draining quite as well, potentially that water's pooling a bit, potentially an area where we're mowing a little bit lower than other areas. Be a bit odd based on this location, but certainly worth considering here. But really my focus here would not be to default to a fertilizer application. If we start to see thinning or patches develop in the lawn, I want to consider going back to, has there been a change in the weather? Also just make sure that we're putting enough water down and then be able to move forward from there. If we apply fertilizer, and let's say that this were an area which was tending to collect water, and let's say we start to see a fungal bloom take place, right? Applying fertilizer in most of those situations is going to exacerbate the issue, right, rather than improve it. So instead, I'd be looking, if we just considered or complete an audit of the sprinkler system, realize this area tends to be receiving a bit more water, and we cut back on the water, we'd see the area improve naturally. You can see in the middle of the screen here with the magnifying glass, lesions on the grass blades are always a great a factor to keep an eye out for. So if you start to see yellowing in the lawn, take a look at the close-ups of the grass blades. Typically, if there is a disease issue, we'll be able to see these markings on the grass blades. In the center, or the photo right next to the green blades, we see these patches or yellowing patches start to develop again. Could be a number of factors, potentially. Yeah, I'd say most likely not snow mold for further south, but could be looking at pest pressure, right? So if there are areas which seem to be a bit more isolated, isn't always the case, but if the grass is no longer well rooted, or if we complete a soapy water flush test and we find evidence of chinch bugs, for example, this is a great sign that the pest could be the issue, right? Typically, our focus is to maintain a nice, thick, healthy turf to discourage the majority of these pests from laying eggs or from taking hold in these areas. But again, applying fertilizer would most likely exacerbate the issue if the grass is already stressed. And then finally, just general yellowing or a golden color throughout the lawn could be a sign of drought stress, right? So again, going back to the idea of identifying, okay, this tends to be an area which doesn't receive quite as much water as the rest of the lawn, or we've seen an increase or a spike in the temps. Are we going to look to adjust our watering schedule? So potentially we're looking to adjust the duration, or depending on the number of waterings per week, are we going to consider additional watering without running into it too frequent of a schedule? Or are we going to allow the lawn to essentially go gold for a period of time? Right? Both are acceptable options. Just need to chat about what the optimal choice is. So as a summary, if you're looking at yellowing patches of the lawn and you see and the area has weak roots, right? You pull on the grass and it's no longer well rooted, this could be a sign of pest pressure. If you start to see a spongy or almost a discolored appearance, could be a sign of a fungus, right? Typically an area with a bit more moisture. And if you see a dry area where footprints are remaining, could be a sign of just general drought stress, right? And that's where we'd be considering the allowing the lawn to go gold or adjusting the watering plan. But the key takeaway from this is none of these situations required fertilizer to improve the area, right? And that's the key takeaway with summer stress, right? It's not that we can't apply fertilizer, but if we start to see changes within the lawn, I want to be extremely mindful of what is actually at play, because if we misdiagnose what's occurring, or if we just assume, hey, the grass needs a bit of nitrogen or it needs a bit of fertilizer, we can end up exacerbating the situation, or there might have been a simpler option, which would have, both from a short-term and a long-term perspective, accelerated the repair process per se. Keeping all this in mind, I realize we only have about 5 minutes left, but this is really where we start to transition to how do we begin to repair these areas, right? So like I said, watering is certainly a factor. So from a disease perspective, adjusting that watering schedule in most situations improve the area. But if there are thinner areas or areas we want to thicken up, for warm season grasses, some grasses can be seeded, right? So Bermuda, for example, centipede and zoysia can be seeded, but typically take a bit longer to germinate and establish. So we have to be a bit more careful in terms of when we're looking to seed, right? A late summer seeding makes me a bit nervous depending on where we're at in the country. And for St. Augustine, it doesn't produce viable seed, right? So we'd be looking to plug the area. So if this all sounds interesting, keep an eye out for our next set of webinars. Ivana, that's end of August for warm season?
I believe so. It's going to be
Okay.
August or September, but we're going to have a great one on looking to repair areas in the fall, not necessarily seeding because it might not be the best time, but at least just patching up some areas and making it healthy for the upcoming winter and subsequent spring.
So stay tuned for that webinar, but I'll spill the secret here shortly that top dressing is a great practice to consider, but we'll chat in more detail about that in the actual repair webinar. So in terms of questions, we did receive a few questions. So the first question we have here, during the summer, the grass starts to thin out and there are lots of bare spots within the lawn, just having a few blades of grass left, looking forward to potential solutions. Great question. So again, this is where I would start to consider some of the information we discussed on this slide here, right? Considering if it could be an environmental factor, if it could be lack of water, pest pressure, different, again, a bit more odd for a warm season lawn to have a mix of grasses, but potentially if we had some weeds, so crabgrass, for example, mixed within the lawn, that would be could have a patchy lawn. But Ivana, any thoughts there for improving these areas?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I can think of that might be contributing to this. If it's something that is happening every year, I would either look at, your watering, your soil texture, or something that a lot of people don't think about when they go buy the cheapest brand of grass seed they can. It could be that there are seeds in there. A lot of places will add like an annual rye, for example, that can't tolerate hot temperatures. So they seed. It looks fantastic in spring. It's doing great. All of a sudden in summer, you get these huge bare areas where all of that grass has died off. But for anything, if you're looking to repair these bare areas, I know it's really hot right now. If you wait until temperatures are a little bit lower, in the 90s, in the 80s if you can lightly top dress, asterisk, some of these areas. usually when they're out of full sun, or doing it in the evening or morning, top dressing is just the act of putting a little bit of topsoil or compost down. For this time of year, I would recommend just topsoil since it doesn't stay as warm. So just putting a little bit of that in those bare or thin areas will encourage your grass to spread there. So for example, if you have St. Augustine, you'll see these big, thick, vining looking guys. Those are runners or stolons. You can move those if they're going one way and you can pin it to go another way. Move those into those bare areas and repair them. So right now you can do some light top dressing. You just want to be very careful to not burn your lawn with that new organic matter you're setting down. And oh, good. Well, sorry.
Nope, I was just pulling up the question. So yeah, go ahead, Yvonne.
Yeah, Patricia. So there are, yeah, the spurge, the crabgrass, the brown areas were more to highlight the weeds there. So right now you don't want to do a lot of weed control because your grass won't very quickly cover those areas again. So if you can kind of go into maintenance mode, some of those you can kind of just leave for a little bit until it's a little bit cooler and you can get rid of them. For now, if it's something that's spreading very quickly, so for example, that crabgrass, I do tend to either hand pull it or if I can't, just mow often and bag those clippings, and that will help remove any seed heads. It'll remove anything that might just try to root in your lawn if you were to leave it on the soil, for example. For spurge, it is something that can be a nuisance. It's not usually one that will choke out your grass, so that's another thing I tend to leave until it cools down a little bit. For the most part, it's the best thing to hand pull. There are herbicides that work on it, but a lot of times they can harm your grass. So I do tend to hand pull those with gloves as they have that white sap on them. But that's another thing where just mowing often and bagging your clippings will remove the ways for them to spread. Another thing with crabgrass and spurge both is they like frequent shallow watering. So that's something that if you see a lot of that taking over your lawn, spreading very quickly, I know this year was a really bad year for weeds, so they're going to be there. But if it's something that's really starting to take over, that's usually a sign to cut back on your watering just a little bit. Just take one of the sessions away, but make the rest of the sessions a little bit longer. So if you're watering 3 times a week for 10 minutes, water twice a week for 15 to 20 minutes, that kind of thing. And they both like very short grasses as well. So that's somewhere if you have a St. Augustine or a zoysia, just mowing higher will also help shade those out and keep them from coming back.
Great question. And it looks like we did have one other question as part of the registration process. Greg from Texas, how to handle the high heat impact of summer on St. Augustine. So yeah, great question. Like I said, I'd say primarily looking at the watering schedule, being sure we aren't mowing too short or have a dull mower blade. And then we can essentially, once the temps start to drop a little bit here, next month or so, we could add a bit of topsoil, or no, we could certainly do so, just being mindful of the current conditions. So hope that's a good starting point, but do not hesitate to follow up if you have any remaining questions, which brings us to our final slide here. Please submit any questions or remaining questions to webinars@getsunday.com. We're always happy to chat, but in terms of future webinars, like we said, there will be a webinar focused solely on fall repair, also chatting about potential other stressors to keep an eye out for heading into the fall months. Really excited about what we have planned over the next couple of months. We hope to see you there, but hope everybody has a great rest of your night and take care.
Okay, bye all. Have a good one.